Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this next section of our course on trust, where we'll be focusing in on trust in times of crisis. So far, we've established how vital trust is to the health of any organisation, and we've been looking specifically at schools. We've thought about and looked at what leaders should do and what they shouldn't do in order to ensure that trust is built so that learning for everyone can flourish and organisations can continue to grow, innovate and improve. And with this in mind, in this section of the course, we'll shift to a focus on leading through these crises. Let's start with an important statement on this. Trust powerfully impacts individuals' ability to respond constructively to crisis. I'll just say it again. Trust powerfully impacts individuals' ability to respond constructively to crisis. Yet, it's during crisis episodes that trust is also most threatened. So during crises, when trust is most required, it's also more likely to be lost. As such, leaders need to work to intentionally preserve trust in the face of the numerous challenges that crises create. And in this section, we'll look at some of the recommended practices for preserving trust, in particular, trust between a head of school and colleagues, employees, let's say, although these practices will inevitably impact positively on other community groups as well. I'm going to share the story of my school as a kind of case study. We continue at the moment to navigate an ongoing crisis, and I hope that by sharing some examples of how these practices that we'll look at together have helped us to stay afloat through these stormy waters, they'll become even more real and useful for you. In fact, we have some examples of how using these practices in these difficult times have even enabled us to enhance trust further. So looking at what is in store for this particular section, as I said, we'll use our school story as an ongoing example. We'll think about how to build credibility and responsiveness before crises occur to make us stronger and more effective in our response. As I said, we'll take a look at some researched practices, particularly for preserving employee trust during a time of great disruption. We'll also dive a little into trust and governance and the kinds of actions we can take there. And we'll return to one of the practices that we'll study for a deeper dive, communication. We'll talk about communication. And to wrap it up, we'll think about some of the potential silver linings that these extraordinarily difficult situations can produce. So as I said, we'll be looking at our story at PSI, Pečersk School International. And I'll start by talking about a crisis that has impacted all of us, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. It created a whole array of significant threats. It threatened our own health, the health of our families and friends and our school communities, and it also threatened the health of our own organisations. I know of many school leaders who had to make sudden and significant changes to sustain their school's viability during this time and to ensure the organisational survival. Some of us had to make some very difficult and likely unpopular decisions. We did initially freeze the pay rise for the following school year. We were fortunate enough to be able to suspend this and return to our usual salary steps because our enrolment did actually continue to grow. But we did share this notion that we might well have to freeze the salaries. I know some schools even had to cut pay, and some were forced into a terrible situation where reduction in force was necessary. And of course, alongside all of this, our teachers were thrown into a world that was quite different and had no choice but to enhance skills exponentially in terms of online learning and its expectations. And our students entered a different world of learning too, as did the parents. In fact, almost everyone, I think, experienced a heightened sense of vulnerability. And so as leaders, this put much more pressure than ever on us to find ways to maintain trust. We needed to demonstrate that we deserved the continued trust of all of our communities groups. At PSI, we did our best, as I believe everyone did, to respond proactively. We intentionally considered how we could interact with everyone thoughtfully, kindly, openly, transparently, and of course at the same time pragmatically. We worked hard to preserve our strong sense of community and connection. And our employee retention rate remained high as a result of this, as did our enrolment. It grew. And we began the school year 21-22 with a strong sense of optimism, and we intentionally heightened our emphasis on our core values, and in particular our core value of joy. So it was going well, and we'd learned some wonderful lessons, and then we were hit by another, even more destructive crisis when, on the 24th of February 2022, the Russian Federation began its full-blown attack on Ukraine. And I ask at this point for you to pause this video and to go to the slide deck, which is available on a separate tab, and to watch the short video that you can see highlighted here on the screen, which will help to provide a little bit more context for the rest of the story, as it were, and for the way that we responded, the ways that we responded to the challenges. I hope that the video was useful to create the context as intended. It's true that crises come in many shapes and sizes, and that the example I'm sharing of our school does reflect a particularly large crisis, a far-reaching and enormously disruptive one on a national and international level, in addition to what it's doing to our own school. It's an extreme, but it does provide, I think, a good example of the importance of preparedness in the sense of concrete planning, and preparedness also in the sense of building and maintaining a strong and trusting community. The former contributes also to the latter. So in some cases, planning and preparing can even prevent crises from occurring at all. In other cases, preparedness helps us to navigate challenges with a much higher chance of a successful outcome. Preparedness also builds confidence in our own ability to get through the challenge. It builds the confidence of others in our ability to do so too. And practically speaking, I want to say that you really must make sure that you do have a full suite of crisis management documentation. What you'll need will be dependent on your own context, of course, but the more you have and the more detailed it is, the better. Regular tabletop exercises can keep important members of the community involved in crisis management focused on the safety, and can help to build a team likely to be much more effective when a crisis occurs. In our case, and in relation to the war waged against Ukraine, as tensions continued to rise, we did invest in a business continuity and evacuation plan. This was customised for us following a 2-day team visit by a group specialising in risk management and resiliency. It was an expensive exercise, but honestly, it was worth every penny. We shared all of this information regarding preparation, this notion of preparing for the worst whilst hoping for the best, was how we labelled it with our community. And we shared with everyone the documentation too. We made the most of our relationships with the different embassies who were in the city at the time, and we communicated with them often, and we let everyone know that we were doing so. All of this helped to build community trust and confidence in our approach. And I highly recommend that you consider how you can get involved in this preparedness as well. So let's just return for a second to thinking about the trust that we did manage to engender at our school during the pandemic, because it is most certainly helping us to navigate the extended crisis that we're experiencing now. I realise that much of the success that we are experiencing in terms of sustained trust is mirrored in the research of Nicole Gillespie, Rosalind Searle, Stephanie Gustafsson and Veronica Hope Haley. Their research has resulted in the development of practices for preserving employee trust during crisis. The researchers suggest that the recommended practices can bolster and sustain trust in hard times in two main ways. First, they reassure employees that their organisation will continue to be trustworthy and behave predictably in how it responds to crisis and in how it treats its employees. The definition that they share of trustworthiness as comprising of three key components, benevolence, integrity, and ability, has much in common with the 5 facets of trust explored in an earlier module, as you'll remember. Secondly, the recommended practices reduce employees' perceptions and sense of vulnerability by decreasing the sense of uncertainty created by a crisis. This is achieved by involving employees in making the necessary decisions that affect them, providing them with a sense of control and emphasising the core values and the mission of the organisation. Involvement in decision-making and the transparency that accompanies it can reassure employees that their organisations will never blindside them. I think it's important that we take a look at these practices one by one. First, you'll see here the practice which is about building a mental bridge to the future, founded on core values and purpose. Please do take the time to read and process this slide. It's on the slide deck too, so you can look at it and dwell on sections that are more impactful in terms of you. But the overall goal of practice 1 is to shift the employee mindset away from one that's focused on the future as uncertain and unpredictable to one where there's a sense of understanding about what's going on now, a sense of understanding how the organisation is navigating the crisis and what will be done to protect the organisation into the future. To achieve this goal, it's really necessary to have frequent, clear and scrupulously honest communication. Communication that allows for dialogue to ensure that understanding is real. This is what's strongly recommended. I have also understood that simplifying and making communication more accessible is hugely important. So instead of weekly written communications, which had a tendency to get long at the best of times and were getting longer and longer as crises developed, we now produce short videos with accompanying slide decks, much in the same way, in fact, as I'm presenting to you during this course. And this is more accessible. People are talking about how they can plug in their earphones when they're driving in the car, or they can listen while they're preparing dinner, whatever. It definitely is having a positive impact. We also have continued to hold town halls, which we established during the pandemic and where everyone's invited to interact. There were times during the pandemic when these town halls were very challenging. There were divergent opinions shared as to how the school should be responding. And there were times when I worried that they would put us in danger of splitting our community. But honestly, through this active listening and inviting all voices to be heard, we did learn from each other. We were able to explain our decision-making processes. So we were clear that decisions were made through obtaining expert opinion and combining this with our own data. so that within the context, of course, of the local authority requirements and with our own core values in mind and being used as our compass, we made the best decisions possible. We weren't driven by the loudest voice or the loudest opinion. And so even though there were moments when there were significant disagreements, there was ongoing respect. We also held really frequent team briefings for our colleagues and employees, allowing for dialogue with them as well. And these were really important. So questions were asked, misunderstandings were clarified. And in addition, we created Google Docs, which were open to the view of the whole community, where questions could be posed and where we responded in a detailed and most timely manner that we could. All of this aligns, as you can see, with many of the practices that are recommended by the researchers here on this slide. The next practice, the second one, is also, of course, fundamentally important. And in this instance, the overall goal is to move the faculty and staff mindset away from that awful feeling of being overwhelmed, confused, and stressed. As we learnt in our earlier section, long-term stress is extremely damaging. We need to move our employees away from the worry that their job may be lost, to a stronger sense that the employer really cares about them and is ready and willing to support them as much as they can during this time of challenge. So when the pandemic first impacted PSI, we increased the frequency of these virtual interactions for our employees. We invited everyone to share their concerns. And as I said, we responded openly and we didn't shy away from the possibilities of the worst case scenarios. We talked about them. We took the stance of bounded optimism and calm. I'll pop some readings about that onto the tab as well. And we welcomed ideas to support well-being. In fact, we enhanced our local staff's medical cover to include counselling and psychological support, which brought it in line with our overseas colleagues. And I was very glad that we had uncovered this inequity as well. Another way of increasing trust is when you take action on something of that kind. As leadership team members, we shared our own stories. We encouraged colleagues to seek the support they needed, explaining that we were doing that very thing. We created a new position as well, a well-being lead. And we also introduced a lot more flexibility into the school day in terms of arrivals and departure times and where people were working. And all of this enhanced that kind of trust organisation-wide, the mutual respect and trust. All of this proved to be a very valuable preparation for the next crisis on the horizon. Let's take a look at the third practice. The intention of this one is to move colleagues away from the feeling that they have no control over or input into what's going to happen to them. It shifts them from anxiety about how they might be treated to an expectation and experience of being treated fairly and well. Through this practice, they'll have a say in decisions that affect them, and they'll have the chance to play a role in helping the organisation to navigate the crisis. Again, our chosen communication methods helped in this regard. We empowered our staff association group to invite concerns and to work together on solutions. And there were times, I have to say, when I did feel disappointed by feedback. Sometimes it felt like we could never do enough, I suppose because we really couldn't. And in reality, we had to gain strength from each other, and we had to accept the constructive criticisms and sometimes not so constructive criticisms we received. I did gain strength from my supportive colleagues and from our board members, and we all made an effort not to deflect or deny the issues raised, but to value them and put them on the table for group exploration. So we didn't always solve them, but we did avoid them going underground. We avoided them becoming the basis for gossip or unconstructive criticism. And in some cases, we had some breakthroughs whereby we were able to enhance situations that were causing people additional distress. There's a lot there to take in, and I encourage you to take a very careful look at those. I will include a connection activity that will help you to look at those in more depth. And I also wanted to draw your attention to another piece of work that emerged during the pandemic, and it's an article about academic leadership in times of crisis by Fernandez and Shaw. It's another very good source for best practices during challenging times. In this study, the authors describe 3 leadership practices that they propose as best practices during crisis. They talk about connecting with people as individuals and establishing mutual trust through intentional behaviours. And one of those intentional behaviours is something that I worked on really hard, and that's deliberate calm. The second one they describe is the importance of distributing leadership through the organisation and of leveraging that collective knowledge, those collective skill sets of the whole community, in fact. This was vitally important to us to make use of everybody in our community's skills and understandings. And finally, they talk about communicating clearly. This is a repeat as well. They talk about how you should be clear and you should communicate frequently with all of the different stakeholder groups. The message and the medium by which you deliver your communication should also be very carefully considered. And I've already talked about our response to that. They do say that using more than one communication channel to get a message across is advisable. And they also talk about the importance in a crisis of offering both personal and professional support on a very human level, about how academic leaders can maintain institutional morale by doing this. Yet in a crisis, perhaps the most important of all is emotional intelligence and emotional stability, they say. This allows the academic leader to place the interests of others above their own, to really live that servant leadership model. So since connecting with people and establishing mutual trust, as well as transitioning to a shared leadership paradigm can take time, it's clear that as leaders, we must prioritise these responsibilities immediately upon accepting our positions and not wait for a crisis to occur. As I said, I want to spend a little bit longer on this whole topic of communication. I've thought long and hard about this and continue to reflect on the most impactful models and approaches. What I do know, though, through experience, is that members of the community always have questions, concerns, mistaken assumptions, even sometimes wild thoughts. And these can be multiplied hugely in times of crisis. So as the head of a school, you need to connect frequently with your community, all facets of it. And you need to do this even more importantly during crisis, being as visible and accessible and as approachable as you can be. You need to communicate directly and transparently about the challenges the organisation and all of its people are facing. Our case is, as crises always are, multi-layered, and we know that honesty is about communicating the facts, even and perhaps especially when they're unsettling. Let's just shift away from employee and colleagues for a moment and think more specifically about our boards. It's our role as the head of school, of course, as the leader of the school. We're responsible for taking a lead on the relationships that we have. The board must be able, of course, to trust the information that you're supplying them with and trust that they're receiving it in a timely, accurate manner, that it's unfiltered and that it includes all the elements that allow it to make the board then to make educated and wise decisions. The board has to have good reason to trust in the integrity and competence of the head of school. In this way, you'll avoid intrusiveness and micromanagement, even during the good times. But the head of school needs to feel empowered, right, as they engage in accomplishing mutually agreed upon goals. And this is the way to help that empowerment, that sense of empowerment. Equally, the head of school needs to be able to count on the board's support, to be able to seek advice and guidance, and to have them standing by your side through those difficult times. So, unhindered communication between the head of school and the board helps to build this necessary trust. This takes time, though. It takes work. It means getting to know your board members, especially, but not exclusively, your board chair. So a really excellent resource, Board Source, which is a site that does require paid membership, but is one that I highly recommend, lists a really useful, shares a list of very useful behaviours and applications, actions to improve the efficacy and openness, and as a consequence to instill trust. So I'll just put these on the screen one by one for you to consider. Of course, in our case, we can be the Chief Education Officer, the CEO. As these are appearing on the screen, think about your own board and which of these are already true for how you operate and which of these are areas that you could be exploring, beginning right now in preparation for anything that might be waiting around the corner. And in all honesty, these kinds of actions create a much more healthy board head of school relationship in the best of times too. I'm sorry, I went a little fast there, but you can find the slide, the copy of those on the slideshow as well. So please refer to that too. This slide I wanted to share as a very personal example of this notion of relationship building. It clearly is a two-way street, but I do see it as the head of school as one of my responsibilities to build that honest, respectful relationship where I'm accountable, but also know that I can depend upon my board. This needs genuine care in the relationships. Members need to be able to depend upon each other, and our individual and our collective performance is definitely dependent upon these levels of trust. As the pandemic waned and we were able to meet together again, we organised a celebration. It was actually also to honour our board chair whose tenure was ending, and we wanted to share our heartfelt thanks for the years of service that he had given the school. And on this one evening of music and good food and laughter, we had no idea of the challenge, of course, that lay ahead of us. But we did know that the group was standing strong together and that we would be ready to rise to additional challenges in the future. So I strongly encourage you to find ways that work for you and for your board members to build these genuinely strong ties, this sense of mutual respect and of care for each other. You'll recall earlier that I suggested this survey to be taken for you and your leadership team. Of course, you could also consider looking at this tool in relationship to your board. it's interesting to return at this point to the idea of neuroscience and oxytocin and think about which of those oxytocin factors are the highest and the lowest in your boardroom. This could well provide the context that you need to make a decision about the actions that you would want to take in the future. So, again, just returning to communication, something else that we have done as a school at PSI is to maintain a really strong communication policy, let's say, with our own community locally and on a wider, much more global scale. So the communication plan is one of being open and proactive in our global community. And it's helped us, I strongly believe it's helped us to instill more trust and confidence within our own group and within our own people, because we are out there sending our messages and sharing our difficulties, but also our successes with the rest of the world. And to almost finish, I wanted to talk about the silver linings, which do exist in this huge effort that's necessary to preserve trust through crisis. Enhanced bonds is definitely one. I feel that very strongly at the moment. I'm not sure I'll ever have a situation quite like this one, where the sense of camaraderie and appreciation and of genuine love and care for each other in our community, it's really strong and tangible at the moment. We also have increased levels of agility. We've had no choice but to be very, very flexible and very ready to respond to the necessities of change. We've also increased our resilience significantly, as well as community members' trust in the school's ability to respond to future crises because of all of this. So again, investing in relationships during a crisis will absolutely strengthen the bond between students and faculty, students and leadership, students and staff, and the whole community. In fact, if you take all of the different groups and make a spider's web, you will increase that sense of trust in every single one of those possibilities. It's an investment that you'll see repaid in full, and hopefully we'll have evidence of this too once this current crisis passes, that we will have relationships forged during these times that are extremely meaningful and that our engagement can become long-term. We'll maintain these special outcomes right into the future when the crisis does subside. So just to end on the kind of behaviours that we need during crisis, there's no doubt that the challenges can seem absolutely overwhelming. But we must, in order to not only keep our heads above water, but to move ahead successfully, we have to seize every opportunity. And in sharing how best to seize this moment, Gordon from 2009 writes, "Rather than hiding from pressure, they, the best, rise to the occasion. As a result, the best defines the moment rather than letting the moment define them. To seize the moment, don't let your failure define you, let it fuel you. Don't run from fear, face it and embrace it. Don't let the moment define you, you define the moment. Define it by knowing that your practice and preparation have prepared you well. Define it with your mental strength, faith and confidence." I've used that quote time and time again over the last few months to help me to maintain my sense of bounded optimism and calm. And I hope that sharing these personal experiences and interweaving them with the research has been useful to you. I have posted a few discussion prompts and based on all of this, and I look forward to engaging with you directly about it all very soon.